welcome back to Professional Development, the New York City Teacher Podcast. I'm your host, Noah, and this week's episode is the second installment in an ongoing series on the history of our union, the UFT. We left off at the 1968 teacher strike, which was in response to the dismissal of 18 teachers by the Ocean Hill-Brownsville Community School Board. We didn't go very in-depth in that moment in history because I didn't feel like I had very much to add to the excellent scholarship that is already out there covering it. If you haven't checked out the episode of School Colors that I linked in the episode 8 description, I cannot recommend it enough. If we do go back to that topic, which I think is certainly a possibility, provided I can find a place to add to the extant research and content that's already out there, then I think it would center the event itself and not the UFT, so as to shift the focus away from the UFT and divide the spotlight more equitably among all of the actors in the story. But anyway, the conflict between the UFT and the community-controlled school board of Ocean Hill-Brownsville did not conclude until the 18 educators were offered their old positions back and a new contract was struck between the UFT and Mayor Lindsay, in which the salary scale was reduced from 15 to 7.5 years. Board contributions to the UFT Welfare Fund were increased, and the union became an agency shop, which is something we discussed a bit with Jeff, meaning that any teacher in New York City public schools, whether a member of the union or not, had to pay agency fees to the UFT for the collective bargaining from which they benefited as teachers in New York City public schools. You might recall also from the Labor Day bonus episode, or maybe one of several chapter meetings that took place in your school in around 2018, that the Janus decision essentially declared compulsory agency fees unconstitutional. And what that means now is that teachers have the option not to join the union and not to pay even the agency fees that go towards collective bargaining. However, in 1969, this was for the very first time not the case. They had to pay those agency fees as of this new contract. One other notable development in the new contract was a provision for pay in exchange for covering absent teachers' classes. Current events-wise, this is something on a lot of our minds. In my school, we have held a steady minimum 10% rate of absence among teachers for over a week at this point, probably closer to 2 weeks, which has meant quite a few coverages, since we have yet to meet the 10,000 substitute teachers Mayor de Blasio has hiding in a wing of Gracie Mansion. As part of our contract, teachers are required to serve one coverage every semester. But beyond that, they are entitled to additional compensation, thanks to this new contract development in 1969. If you are in the same boat as me and my colleagues, be sure to keep track of your coverages and put in for that compensation. Perhaps of greatest consequence to the history of public education in New York City around this time period, though, was the fact that the Ocean Hill-Brownsville Community-Controlled School Board was essentially dissolved and absorbed into the new structure of 31 and later 32 decentralized districts. The UFT presents the story of the Ocean Hill-Brownsville Community School Board as a fight for due process and professionalism. But from where I'm sitting, it looks a great deal more like revolutionary rumblings centering racial and social justice in the late 60s being struck down comprehensively by white liberals. The UFT's retelling of the events jumped directly from the destruction of the offending community school board to the union's efforts to recruit minority school teachers nationwide, create the UFT Scholarship Fund, selectively reduce class sizes, open daycares in high-need areas, and unionize paraprofessionals, who at the time were mostly minority women and entirely low income. It's some really deft misdirection, I think, to point to work meant to heal relations between a predominantly white teachers' union and the largely black and brown communities supposedly served by the teachers' union, right after detailing how the former swatted away the agency and opportunity to collaborate on a more even playing field with the latter. That said, the unionization effort among paraprofessionals is an important moment in the union's history. In the present day, paras are every bit as essential to keeping a school running as teachers. The paraprofessional position grew out of a need to provide more individualized support to students with special needs, who figured prominently in the Great Society legislation that came out of the Johnson administration. The pay for paras early on was dismal, and opportunities for career advancement were practically non-existent. But the paras represented a large group of municipal workers in a time in which, as the teachers had demonstrated, municipal workers could organize and secure their demands. Thus, DC 37 and the UFT competed to represent paras. They both wanted paras within their ranks. So the UFT got the inside bend on DC 37 by pointing to everything it had secured for teachers over the past 10 years, as well as offering a path to transition from para to teacher, a sort of career ladder. Thus, the UFT won. It swelled its membership to 70,000 workers, and paras had representation, were unionized. Just like it had done with teachers, the board stalled in salary negotiations for paras in 1970, setting the stage for the UFT to call a strike with the support of teachers. This forced the negotiations to resume, which led to a near doubling of wages for paras. The support of the mostly white teachers for the mostly black and brown paras helped some in rehabilitating the image of the UFT, which had, rightly so, suffered a blow in 1968. And the solidarity between teachers and paras, as well as the willingness to participate in job actions whenever it deemed necessary, made the UFT one of the most powerful political forces in New York City by 1970. The U.S. economy revealed itself in the early 1970s to be held together with chewing gum and string. And teachers, as public employees, really had to mobilize in order to keep the hands of poor city budget planners out of their pockets. Throughout 1970 and 1971, the mayor and Al Shanker went back and forth over the number of teaching jobs that would have to be cut in order to balance the city budget. In the end, the threatened 11,250 layoffs were averted through an increase in income and other taxes, though a few thousand jobs were lost to attrition. By September of the 70 to 71 school year, there were over 20,000 more students in New York City public schools, but 5,000 fewer teachers. Cuts in guidance counselors and other service providers were also a problem, and there were no new substitute teachers. By 1972, the chancellor was trying to squeeze productivity increases out of teachers in the form of a longer school day, a longer school year, fewer prep periods, and modifications to seniority, transfers, leaves, and retirement processes. Though it was ready to strike, as always, it turned out the UFT didn't have to go to that extreme this time around, as there were sympathetic representatives of community school districts on the negotiating board who were able to advocate for teachers and secure much more favorable results, including the maximum raise allowable at the time under the new economic policies enacted by then-President Nixon, meant to address the wild inflation of the time. In 1972, UFT teachers got to cross a picket line that needed to be crossed. Parents in Canarsie boycotted a junior high school to which black and brown students were being bused. A crowd of 1,000 angry white people showed up to hurl abuse at black students as they were escorted by police into the building. Al Shanker showed up in person to lead the teachers in as their neighbors yelled and cursed at them. So this event would be, it's one tick in the right side of history column for the UFT. In April of 1974, the Board of Education announced a pilot accountability program that it had developed in partnership with the Educational Testing Service and the UFT. The UFT welcomed this program, with Sandra Feldman, then UFT Director of Staff, quoted as saying it would identify our own effectiveness and give us the concrete proof we need that schools and teachers can do a good job if resources are provided. It will examine all of the factors that affect learning, separate out the socioeconomic effects on which schools have no influence at all, and find out what in-school factors make for effective learning, what works and what doesn't. While the plan was approved in 1974, it was never fully implemented, and it was basically dead by 1978. It was not until the No Child Left Behind era, in the aughts, that an accountability system would be implemented successfully in New York City public schools. In 1975, there was an $883 million hole in the city budget. Then Mayor Beam expected to have to cut 38,000 city jobs. The loss of Title I funding had already cost 2,000 paraprofessional jobs. School lunches were cut, sports and after-school programming was gone, bilingual instruction was out, psychological counseling, kindergarten, everything was getting cut. September 8th, 1975 was the first day of school for the 75-76 school year, and also the day before the contract was set to expire. 7,000 teachers had been laid off over the summer, and Mayor Beam had signed legislation allowing him to impose a wage freeze. Class sizes soared to 60. There were multiple grades in some classrooms, and there was no support staff to be found in many school buildings. The membership of the UFT voted overwhelmingly to strike, which it did for 5 days. The strike ended with a 2-year pact that would maintain class sizes at their contractual limits. In order to make this happen, teachers would give up 2 45-minute prep periods that they would then regain when student school days were shortened twice a week. This way, the board wouldn't have to pay for coverages. There was also a $300 cost of living adjustment, a $50 per member welfare fund increase, and the longevity increments at 10 and 15 years to which we all look forward. The Taylor Law cost striking teachers 2 days of pay for every day that they were on strike, in addition to the pay they would have received had they worked. The board used this savings to rehire some of the laid-off teachers. Labor advocates pointed out, rightly enough, that this provision of the Taylor Law incentivized pushing workers toward striking as a cost-saving mechanism. The state assembly passed a bill to address this perverse incentive, but Senate Republicans blocked it. Oh well. Unfortunately, even with the new contract hammered out, it wasn't as easy as signing on the dotted line. The Emergency Financial Control Board was established when it looked increasingly like the city would go into default. This board rejected the new contract and insisted that teachers defer part of their salaries for 3 years. The Municipal Assistance Corporation, or MAC, also referred to as Big Mac, like the sandwich, had been established to try and rescue the city from financial mismanagement and fill in the deficit by selling bonds. Here's MAC Chairman Felix Rohatyn explaining what was in store for New York City if they couldn't save it.
You know, a financial crisis isn't like taking pictures of missiles in Cuba. You can look at the pictures and you can see the missiles and you can decide you're going to go to war to prevent it. But a financial crisis isn't that. But the bankruptcy of New York could change the city. Nobody knows for sure, but it could change it so dramatically as to have it not be recognizable again.
Felix Rohatyn, financial wizard extraordinary, is the most important man in New York City today. He's chairman of the Municipal Assistance Corporation, or Big Mac as it's more commonly known, after America's favorite hamburger. Big Mac is a committee of the city's leading financiers and bankers set up by the state of New York to raise the billions of dollars needed by the city of New York to save it from default or bankruptcy. What does default mean?
Well, I've said that I thought default was a little bit like stepping into a warm bath and slashing your wrists, because you really might not feel anything the moment you did it, but you'd begin to die right then and there.
Unfortunately, nobody was buying the bonds, and their price dipped incredibly low. The MAC board members were responsible for finding $1.15 billion to cover half of the $2.3 billion rescue package the legislature had passed. So they looked around nervously at big pots of money they knew existed in the state. Their gaze fell upon the Teachers' Retirement System, or TRS, the same fund that we pay into today in the hopes of having a pension when we reach retirement age. Rohatyn counted on TRS to buy up enough bonds to cover the debts that would come due in short order. But the TRS trustees had no intention of investing more than around $138 million. Rohatyn doubled down and told the press that everything was in the UFT's hands. Their decision would make or break the entire city. Eventually, after much deliberation, the UFT bought the bonds and saved the day. Throughout the remainder of the 1970s, schools continued to be systematically underfunded. Teacher-to-student ratios got dramatically worse in 1976, and the city stopped buying learning materials and fixing buildings. With the new mayor, Ed Koch, taking office in 1978, the UFT continued to struggle to get a new contract that wasn't either shot down by the Emergency Financial Control Board or riddled with working conditions givebacks. Mayor Koch was desperate to restore faith in the fiscal policy of New York so that the city could rebuild its credit. In another deal that saw the TRS floating money to the city in order to secure a new contract for teachers, MAC sold $138.7 million in bonds to the Teachers' Retirement System, and Koch agreed to an 8% wage increase over a 2-year period. The new contract was approved, but paras were left out, as the provision to make them salaried employees eligible for pensions was a step too far for Koch. They would have to wait until 1983 for their positions to earn them pensions. The UFT's top priority throughout the second half of the 70s was to get laid-off teachers rehired. When they were finally in a position to bring back about 9,000 of the teachers who had been laid off in 1975 and 1976, What they found was that only around 2,000 were even interested. When they surveyed teachers who chose not to return, they learned that teachers' skills made them highly sought after in business, in particular in sales. They could earn more in the private sector than in schools, where, strangely enough, elected officials and their fiscal advisors continued to characterize teacher pensions and wages as absurdly oversized. This is an early sign of the teacher to private sector pipeline that is still going strong to this day, reinforcing the brain drain phenomenon that continues to add to the challenge of adequately staffing schools in New York City. And speaking of adequately staffing schools in New York City, it's time for this week's news update. I want to wish a happy purge to you and yours. Yes, that's right. Around the time this episode airs will be the deadline for submitting proof of the first dose of the COVID vaccine. And judging from the serious tone of all the communications I've had regarding the fallout of this deadline, it seems there will be a lot of teachers going on unpaid leave beginning Monday. Apparently, a huge proportion of school safety agents are not currently vaccinated, or at least weren't as of a few days ago. So as a result, the plan is to drop down to one entrance for schools in which there is only one SSA present, as opposed to the usual 3 or 4 or more. This will impact the entry routine for students, of course, which already includes standing in line, going through the routine health screening process, getting one's temperature checked, and applying a glob of hand sanitizer to one's hands. Now, it will also include a bottleneck through a single entrance. In some cases, for a building that co-locates multiple schools. I personally have been an advocate for removing police from schools for as long as I've worked in or even attended schools. But this was not exactly what I had in mind. I'd always imagined the powers that be might replace the police with other people who could do the job of guaranteeing safety better than police, not just leaving the desk basically unoccupied. I learned by sneaking a peek at the principal's briefing the other day that the positions left open by teachers who choose not to get vaccinated and instead to go on unpaid leave will not actually be opened up to new teachers, as the anti-vax teachers get to keep a right of return for a year. What this means is that students will be taught by a placeholder, an assurance that if their old teacher gets the vaccine, they can come back. Just kidding. Bureaucratic mumbo-jumbo doesn't actually have a teacher's license. So what it actually means is that co-teachers will cease to be co-teachers and will instead be doing coverages for the remainder of the year. So as we alluded to before, apparently de Blasio has a small army of substitute teachers waiting in a wing of Gracie Mansion. I'm wondering why I've done so many coverages over the course of my career if there were qualified subs just waiting for the call. At any rate, it should be an interesting couple of weeks. Another thing I learned while sneaking a peek at the principal's briefing is that the chancellor is not wearing a mask these days in Zoom calls, which means that either she is working from home, and, good for her, or is potentially exposing her office to COVID. And I'm not sure which is worse, honestly. Finally, there were 181 positive cases of COVID identified in schools today, October 1st, bringing the total case count up to 3,211 in just 3 weeks of school. 47 classrooms were closed today, bringing the total cumulative number up to 1,178. There were also 108 partial classroom quarantines that began today, bringing that cumulative figure up to 1,292. And still just one whole school closure since we've returned. Wherever you are working or sending your kid to school or attending school, listener, I hope you are keeping yourself, your colleagues, your students, your friends, and your family safe. This shouldn't be the case, but it seems it really is up to us to take care of one another and ourselves. This concludes the second episode in our ongoing series on the history of the UFT. So far, we've just made it through the 70s, about 20 years of the life of the Union. So I suspect we will be in for a heavy next episode or two in order to make it to the present day. If you, dear listener, have any particular insight into the UFT, either historically or in the present day, be sure to reach out, as it's really a wonderful thing to have guests on the show. Thank you so much to listeners who have already reached out via email to professionaldevelopmentpodcast@gmail.com. It's great to hear from you. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to subscribe wherever you do your podcast listening, but also consider checking out patreon.com/professionaldevelopment for 2 additional episodes every month. That said, we'll see you next week, same time, at patreon.com/professionaldevelopment. Thanks for tuning in.